The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. What a pleasure it is to be able to spend a few weeks talking to Shawn Mendenhall. Welcome back, Shawn.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back for our last episode here before the Q&A session.
Terrific, innovative hand surgeon. We're talking about the surgical approach to spasticity, mostly having to do with the upper extremity. We talked over the last couple of weeks about the history of the surgical approach, and I'm kind of embarrassed about how little I knew. There are things that, as I started to look at it more carefully, and as you explained it to me, the approach really has changed, and I think we have a much more functional approach. And the great beauty of collaborating and working together and figuring out what everyone brings to the table. This week, we want to talk a little bit about how we measure our success and looking forward to the future. Before we do, would you mind disclosing your conflict of interest or not?
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm a consultant for Polynovo, which is unrelated to this topic. And if I could do two other shameless plugs at the beginning of this episode, so I don't forget. But one is I have to put in a plug for, we just opened up a new Intermountain-based primary children's hand surgery clinic. And what we've done, instead of these being university-based clinics, is we've just partnered with Primary Children's. And so we have a new clinic that's at the Eccles Outpatient Center at the Salt Lake City campus of Primary Children's. And then we have, again, an Intermountain-based pediatric hand clinic at the Lehigh Hospital. So these are great, really close collaborations, again, between myself, who's a university faculty member, and with Intermountain Healthcare. And it's really to just focus even more so on the children who have hand problems in our region. So that's a little plug there. And then, of course, if you don't mind, I'd like to put in a plug for my Instagram handle, which is at PedsHandDoc. So if you have any interest in seeing cases or learning more about what we do in sort of the academic realm of pediatric hand surgery, you can follow me there.
And PedsHandDoc, no dashes, no underscores, no spaces.
Correct.
Okay. And how would people refer patients to your clinic at Primary Children's?
So probably the easiest way is just to give us a call. It's 801-585-HAND. And that goes right to our schedulers to schedule both for Primary Children's campuses. And then I do about 1 day a week of adult hand surgery as well. So you can reach that same line that way.
Love the choice of phone number. It makes a difference, by the way. There are about 4 phone numbers that I remember, and the rest I have to look at. But hand, I think I can remember.
Yeah, 585-HAND.
Excellent. Okay, so as I said, we talked a little bit about the history of the approach, and we talked at some length about the types of surgeries that you do. So once you've done surgery, it's all done. Everyone lives happily ever after, and no one gives a thought to the issue again, right?
Not necessarily. So much more accurately, these are children and conditions that we follow really throughout life. And, we do these procedures focusing on what the needs are at the time. And oftentimes, say later on, say we operate in the elementary age years. Well, in the middle school or high school age years, there might be other issues that come up. And with growth spurts and things like that, there might be new muscles that are tight or new joints that are affected. And so, this is unfortunately not really a one and done type of thing, but it's really an ongoing relationship with us and these patients throughout their life. And once the growth has slowed down or stopped, then things tend to settle out a little bit.
You gave a great shout out to your occupational and physical therapy colleagues in physical medicine. It strikes me that they are not only allies in figuring out what to do, but once you've done, then it's what to do further And I would guess that also that one of the things you hope to do is that as you've lived with a problem for a while, you find workarounds, and in some ways you probably have to do some retraining how to use this newfound function.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's where the therapists are really so critical in the outcomes is they can help a lot with that retraining and re-education. And it becomes natural with time, after we do these tendon transfers and things, but it does take some time and effort and some guidance by the therapists.
I'm guessing that there has to be a fair amount of work with families as well, helping manage the expectations as well as, some degree of cheerleading and some degree of managing expectations.
Yeah, there's always some of that in what we do and in medicine in general, right? I think it's setting the tone and setting expectations are really an important part of what we do. I've heard a quote, I don't remember what it is exactly, but being a doctor is something like 10 to 20% of actual treatment and about, 80 to 90% of encouragement. And that's certainly the case with these types of conditions with spasticity. So a lot of it is some cheerleading there and encouragement and working together with therapy and fine tuning too. For example, we can treat things like elbow flexors that are tight. That's a little bit more of a slam dunk. It's a little easier because it's such an easy function, right? The elbow basically flexes and extends. And so when that's out of balance, we can fix that pretty well. But now think about fingers, right? Think about all five fingers, all with independent motion, all with independent tendons and muscles and nerves. And those are much, much harder to get the perfect balance of in these procedures that we do. And so oftentimes those require a little revision surgery here or there to tighten up a tendon or loosen up a tendon or, things like that. So the more distal we go on the upper extremity, the more complex it gets and the harder it is to get it just right with one surgery.
Let's talk about how you define and measure success. What are some of the objective measures that you use?
So this is a little bit of a moving target, but myself and my research team recently just did a super deep dive in all the literature about how do we track outcomes of kids with cerebral palsy. And we looked at a number of things. We looked at both objective measurements that are often clinician recorded, and then we also looked at patient reported outcome measures. And it was so interesting. I had one question going into this, and it was like, what studies should we do before and after these selective nephrectomies and other hand surgeries that will give us the greatest bang for our buck in tracking functional outcomes? And what we learned is, there's a lot out there, and for every condition, there's different outcome measures that are helpful. And unfortunately, there's not one test that's going to do it all for every condition. And so we ended up writing, I think, about 5 papers out of this deep dive in the literature we did. And so we have sort of designed a battery of tests now that sort of cover the most important things. And most of these things are therapy based. So the therapists can do these tests before and after the surgeries to really try to parse out the effect of what we're doing. But there's also just some really simple ones. I mean, just parent and patient satisfaction scales are very helpful. The modified Ashworth scale that we use is very basic. It's very limited, but it's a good just rough measurement of what we're looking at here. And then we have some others. We have, obviously, there's some really good PROMIS scores that we can use for the upper extremities now that are somewhat helpful. Still need a little more validation with time, but anyway, we have certainly a lot of good tests that we can do to give us a good basic idea of what the outcomes are.
You ever find that as you embark on this process, that expectations change in a very realistic fashion? That sometimes you find that you may not be able to be as optimistic as you were before, but other times that you find that you can offer a lot more than you thought you would originally?
Yeah, I think you've sort of hinted at the fact that this is not a perfect science here. And sometimes we go in with a good plan, and it's very rare that we make the patient worse. But sometimes I have higher expectations or lower expectations of what the actual outcome is. But it just shows that we still have a lot to learn in this area. And there's a lot of areas where we can innovate. And there's a lot that the future holds for us that I think will make this better. The problem is we don't know what those things are yet, right? Until we discover them as we go. But yes, just like you said, sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised it's even better of an outcome than I thought. And then sometimes, like I mentioned with the finger balance, sometimes I wish I could have just got that finger balance a little bit better. But so it is something that we're learning a lot about. We're certainly going the right direction. And I think the future is bright with even new and yet uncharted territory that we're coming upon now.
Yeah, and I think finding the balance between durable gains and durable expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's always a balance, right? With surgery, there's risks. Those risks can be anything from anesthetic risks to infection and bleeding and scarring and all of these things. So it's finding that balance, right? Where the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. And I think we're at a pretty good place now where surgery is safer than it's ever been. And it's only getting safer. The medications are getting better. Our surgical techniques are getting better. For example, I couldn't even do what I do now 20 years ago. And the reason is now I can use this little handheld device called a nerve stimulator in surgery. And it's just a little disposable device that puts a little electric current, and I can actually titrate that electric current up or down, and I can touch little nerves, and I know exactly then what muscle that nerve is going to because the muscle will contract. And that ability has just opened up the possibilities of what we can now do with nerve surgery. And that's one of the main reasons why now we can do these hyper-selective neurectomies for spasticity, even though it was first described in the late 1800s. They just didn't have the technology yet to do it well. And so it kind of fell by the wayside, and it's come back over and over throughout the last century. And now we're at this really great point in medicine where, again, we have these great tools that we can use. And so nerve surgery now has gotten more advanced and easier to do than it's ever been before because these little handheld nerve stimulator devices. And again, I'm sure in the next 10 years, we're going to come up with new ones, new
Which seems like
devices.
such a simple thing, right?
Yeah,
And something that you, first of all, are amazed by, and then you begin to take completely for granted.
right. I go to Ukraine, for example, right? Like they don't have access to these things. And so when I go, I basically beg and plead with every single company out there to send me with a bunch of the stuff, donate it to us so we can take it and leave it there. And so I go there and I'm able to show them with these instruments, like, look what we can do now. And then I'm able to leave them with a good supply of those things so they can continue to do it as they treat their own patients. So,
Look at the world of what people are doing. Where do you see the promising innovations on the horizon? As you said, it's difficult. It's impossible to know exactly what's going to happen. There was an article recently in, I think it was the New York Times, that said we always measure whether we're approaching the future by whether we have jetpacks yet. And we don't. But you look around us, and what we do have would be unrecognizable to a physician 100 years ago. But what sorts of things do you see happening?
yeah, it's amazing. I started my journey just looking back at my personal experience. So I graduated high school in the year 2000, right? In Y2K. Everybody thought the world was going to end and all the computers were going to crash when it turned 2000. So I graduated and started college here at the university. And now we fast forward 25 years, and just what I have seen in my quarter of a century in my medical journey has been incredible. I can only imagine what's coming in the future. And I think some of the things, where we've been hoping for, but haven't quite reached yet, are using more cell-based therapies, right? Using stem cells that are safe and that are FDA approved, and doing things like regenerating muscles and nerves and brain tissue and spinal cord tissue. We are at the point where we're on this verge of being able to repair nerves in a totally different way. So the peripheral nervous system, you can repair a cut nerve and it will grow back, but it grows back slowly, about an inch a month, and it also grows back incompletely. And so, for example, a baby that's born with a brachial plexus injury, maybe that can be the topic of our next set of podcasts, Dr. Wirkus. But a baby that's born with a brachial plexus birth palsy, right? That's where the nerves have been torn up by the neck that go down to the arm. Well, we're on the verge now of being able to go in and just reconnect those nerves, but not have to wait for the whole distal nerve to degenerate and the new nerves to grow all the way down, but to just immediately fuse the nerve back together, to fuse those axons back together without having to rely on healing. And so to have instant function back. And there's a new process that's being heavily investigated right now called PEG fusion, where we use this, chemical to actually fuse the axons back together. So if we can do that, then boy, we're getting into this era that maybe we can do that with the spinal cord for spinal cord injuries. Maybe we can do that with the brain, with a cerebral palsy or a stroke, something like that, to be able to prevent all these downstream effects happening like spasticity down the road.
Right, because as we mentioned last time, you have an injury, and a lot of what we see is the progressive result of that injury. So even if you can not have that injured time, you make a lot of difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think the more we can get closer to doing those things, and then, another area that I've always been very fascinated about that's been moving slowly, but I think we're going to have a breakthrough at some point. And that's with being able to more safely and easily do transplantation without as harmful of immunosuppressant medications. So right now, that's one of the biggest limitations to organ transplantation and limb transplantation, face transplants, right, which is where plastic surgery interacts with transplant. Is just the immunosuppressive medications have so many harmful side effects. And we're due for a big breakthrough there. As soon as we can trick the immune system into accepting these new body parts to be their own, that's going to open up a lot of possibilities. If somebody has a destroyed hand, I can just transplant a new one on and completely change their life. Or a new leg, right? Somebody has a non-functional leg or an amputation, we can transplant a new one. And so anyway, that's been an area of some of my previous research and interests, and we're just waiting for that big breakthrough on immunosuppression.
And looking at the timeline from the first week, looking at how things have changed. So you just said 25 years, take that 25, 50 years. It's an entirely different sort of outlook that for both for you and that we offer patients. And that's great.
Yeah, it's very exciting to think about that.
All right. Anything else we ought to talk about?
I did fail to mention in the first episode that, and probably the second most common reason for spasticity that we see children with spasticity is pediatric stroke. So certainly it's by far the most common cause for spasticity in adults, but it's a fairly close second to cerebral palsy for children is pediatric stroke. And that can happen at any age. And there's a lot of overlap, right, between cerebral palsy and stroke. And maybe it was a stroke that happened at birth that led to the cerebral palsy. But anyway, looking back, I just realized I failed to mention that as one of the causes. And many of my patients that I treat with spasticity are from some form of a stroke.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's pencil in talking about brachial plexus injuries, and we'll do that. In the meantime, thank you so much for a fascinating couple of weeks of talking about spasticity and what you guys are offering at this point. Guys, using the word guys in a non-gender specific way. Thanks for listening. Please send your questions to questions@vcurb.com. Thanks to Lisa Stoddard for making this sound like a podcast. And thanks, Janice, for listening. We'll talk to you all next week.
Thanks so much for having me again, Paul. And I'll look forward to hopefully getting some good questions in the next podcast. And we'll do another topic in the future.
Yes, we will. Thanks, Shawn. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Thanks to Phil Wirkus, who composed the theme music. See you next time.